that, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Kim Hargrave of the Denison Pequotsepos Nature Center in Mystic. Thank you and welcome, Kim.
Thank you very much. So I'm so happy to be speaking to everybody here in Glastonbury today, and sounds like a few people are maybe traveling around different areas of the country, either skiing or enjoying some warmth down in Florida. And what is awesome is that our topic today actually involves creatures that span the globe. And we're going to be talking all about bats today. And I have been at the Nature Center for just over 20 years now, and bats happen to be one of my favorite topics. And I think it's partly because people have a lot of misconceptions about these animals, and it's really fun to be able to clear some of those up and to understand the really important role that bats play in our local ecosystems. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about bats in general, everything from their economic and ecological roles, and a little bit more about their anatomy, and then getting down into the nitty-gritty of the species that live here in Connecticut, and then a few things that we can do to help our bat species. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here in just a few minutes. So if you just hold on a second, we'll get that going. And we'll share that. And hopefully everybody's got a nice screen up that says bats of our region. And I did include it as bats of our region because occasionally some of these bats may not be found as commonly here in Connecticut as they may be in New York State or Massachusetts or Rhode Island. And because Connecticut's such a small state, we're really dependent on all of our neighboring states to make a really healthy ecosystem and a healthy place for all of our different wildlife, but bats in particular. So let's just get right into it. So bats are mammals, and I'm pretty sure most people do know that, but every now and then it's a confusing issue. Bats are only true flying mammals. No other mammal can fly. Sometimes you think about a flying squirrel or something like that. Flying squirrels are gliding animals. They're not actually flying creatures. And what's amazing is there's over 1,400 species of them worldwide. And so then when you are actually thinking about, the order of mammals in the world, there's more of bats than there are species of mice or species of deer, anything like that. So when you look at these big groups of animals, bats is a really large and diverse group. They are found pretty much worldwide. They're not in the extreme polar region, so we don't have them in the Arctic or the Antarctic. There's a few islands here and there that they miss, but otherwise you can be in the desert, or you can be in the tropics, or you can be in our temperate areas here, and you will have bats around. The most common place to find bats and where the majority of the species are do tend to be more tropical regions. So Central America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, that's where you find some of the largest populations of bats. So Indonesia alone has over 175 species, but Central America has about a third of the population of bats. So it's pretty cool. So as long as there's enough warm weather for them to find food and shelter, you're going to have some type of bat. Here in Connecticut, we have 9 species of bats, just to kind of put that in perspective there. Unfortunately, in some countries, bats are considered a bad omen and are not protected, which can cause a lot of problems in their local ecosystems. Bats do get a bad rap for spreading disease. Unfortunately, the last 2 years have been further unkind to bats with the spread of the coronavirus and some of the different thoughts on how that disease had started. But bats really spread no more disease than any other wildlife species. So it's just something to keep in mind about them. So we're going to really jump quick right into their ecological and economic roles. And most of the time when we think about bats and their role in the ecosystem, we're often thinking about the tropics. And so I did pick a few tropical bats just to mention here, because Even though they're in the tropics, you might depend on some of the things that bats are doing down there. And so one of the bats that we're looking at here are some of our fruit bats. And these fruit bats are essential for spreading seeds. When an area gets deforested in the tropical rainforest, these bats are responsible for 95% of the reforestation. The seeds that they spread is what's bringing the forest back. So if something happens to that area of rainforest, the bats are going to be the ones that come in to help and get those plants going again. So just like birds here in Connecticut, you know, if a bird eats a blueberry, that blueberry seed has to travel through the digestive system of the bird so that it's scored properly and a new blueberry bush can grow out in our forest. Well, in the tropical environments, a lot of these fruits, the seed has to go through the digestive tract of a bat in order for it to be able to germinate. And so they're really, really important in that regards as well. And they also are pollinators. And so, you know, if you had a banana today, it's very possible that it was pollinated by a bat. If you like mangoes, my kids have been on a mango thing right now. Mangoes are also pollinated by bats. Even things that you may not realize, like dates, almonds, figs, all of those things are bat pollinated. And so the other thing is they also like to pollinate agave plants. And so if anybody here likes tequila, you really need bats for this. If an agave plant is not pollinated by a bat, its seed production drops by 3,000%. So we've got to have bats around if you want to have some tequila. So just from an agricultural perspective and a reforestation perspective, these guys are really, really important. But what about here in Connecticut? You might be like, well, we're not growing any of those things here in our state. Our bats are insect eaters. So all of our bats are pretty much insectivores. There's one minor exception on a rare occasion. We'll talk about it when we get there. But our bats tend to all be insect eaters, and they eat a lot of insects. So if we look up in that top left corner of your screen, you've got a little brown bat right there. And that bat can eat 500 to 1,000 mosquitoes an hour. So just kind of put that in perspective for a little bit. If you've got a few of these bats hanging around your yard, that is so much better than any bug zapper or any horrible bug spray that smells bad. All the citronella candles are never going to be able to do what that one bat right there can do. Now, the other thing is we talk a lot about how bats are really important in controlling agricultural pests, but bats are catching insects that are flying around. And you just have to remember our life cycles of moths and things like that. So remember, the moth is going to lay the eggs on the plant. The plant is going to, that egg is going to hatch into larva. The larva is what's eating the plant. So if we can get rid of the adult moth insects, there's less larvae or caterpillars eating our plants. And so that's why these insects are really, really important. In the United States, it's estimated that bats save about $3.7 billion of in agricultural help just by all the insects that they eat each year. So how do they catch them? All right, so this is just having some good pictures right here so you can kind of see what they're doing is sometimes they'll actually catch them in their wings. So they get that wing way out and they can toss that insect right into their mouth. The other thing that they can do is if you look at the area between their legs, they can use that area kind of as a little baseball catcher's mitt, and the insect will get in there and then they twist their tail up really quick and then they catch it in their mouth as well. They sometimes also just are lucky and can get it right in their mouth, but it's kind of like having that baseball glove. It gives them an extra area to get the insects. A lot of bats will eat while they're flying around, and so that's why they can consume so many insects. If you think about it, if you're trying to catch 500 insects in an hour, you've got to eat fast. You can't be landing every time, sitting down, eating your meal, and then going back out. So they're eating on the wing. We'll talk about a few insects or a few bats who eat larger insects, and so they will have to land to eat those. But these bats right here tend to eat quickly. The bat on the top right-hand part of your screen is a red bat right there, just in case anybody was wondering what that one was. So let's look at the bat anatomy for a little bit. If you've actually ever touched a rubber bat, like those things that people buy for Halloween, that's actually kind of what their wings feel like. It's like this thin rubbery membrane that is stretching between their fingers right here. So if we look at the wings, and you can kind of see in this picture right here, you can see where the thumb sticks up out of their wings, and then their fingers are actually spreading out, and then it's connected to their bodies from there. So that is all this rubbery membrane. And so when a bat gets hurt, so, you know, a cat gets one or something like that, sometimes they can get a hole in that membrane and it prevents them from flying. And so when they come into a rehabilitation facility, they actually have to wait till that part kind of heals up enough so that they can fly, because they can't fly with a hole in their wing right there. So they have their thumbs that stick out. They have these amazing tiny little feet and toes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about their toes in just a few minutes. They can't usually walk very well on the ground. So when a bat gets grounded, you know, they end up on the ground, they don't go very far and they don't go very fast. So they will kind of try to climb away to get away from danger, or they will try to climb up the side of a tree, climb up. A lot of times it tends to be in people's wood piles, is where I hear a lot of bat stories. If they have a bad day and they make a bad decision close to water and they accidentally get into the water instead of just getting the sip or getting the insect off the top, they can swim if they're close to shore and get onto land again, but they'll have to kind of get a little bit dried off and regain their strength before they're able to go up again. So they have this amazing ability, though, to recover, get back up, and start flying again. In general, bats cannot take off from the ground. There's exceptions to everything, but in general, if a bat gets grounded, it gets on the ground, it will struggle to take off. They usually need to climb up a little bit higher to be able to then to fly and take off again. So when a bat's on the ground, that's usually a cause for concern. So let's take a closer look at those hand and wing bones. So if you look at that picture, you can see kind of a picture of a person, pterodactyl for good measure, a bird, and the bat. And so when you look at the purple right there, and those are some of the metacarpal bones right there. You can see it, so your hand bones, right? And then you can see where the finger bones are. You can see that they have a really shortened humerus or upper arm bone compared to people. And you can also see the big difference between their wings and a bird's wings right there. So you can see that it's definitely webbing between the bones, where a bird just has that long bone coming out, and then it's feathers that are creating the wing. All right. So in the bat, it is that webbing that's creating it right there. So their bones are not hollow. So we think about a bird's bones as being hollow or honeycombed. Bats, because they're mammals, their bones are like ours. And so they actually do have marrow in their bones. Their bones are much thinner, though, than a similar sized land animal. So if you think about an animal the size of a mouse or a rat, they have fairly thick bones, where the bat will have thinner bones, and that's definitely helping with their weight right there. So one of the cool things I think about bats is that they spend so much time, you know, hanging upside down by their feet. And if you think about that, like, how do they do that? Like, you can't do it by muscles, because if you've ever like been reading a book and in bed kind of going like this and you fall asleep, the book ends up on your face, because as soon as you fall asleep, you kind of tend to lose control over your arm muscles and your hand muscles and things like that. So what is happening with the bat is they're not using their muscles to hold on with their feet. They're actually using their tendons. And they have these special tendons that connect their legs and their feet all the way up to their upper body. And then as they're hanging upside down, that weight from their body kind of pulls it tight. And so those claws just end up going like this, and they just hang upside down right by those feet. So it's specialized tendons that are allowing them for just to hang upside down while they're sleeping, while they're hibernating all winter. And the fact that they can do it on surfaces that seem very, very smooth to you and I. They're able to get a grip on just small rock crevices and things like that and hang that way. So this is allowing them then to be able to take off in an easier direction. People aren't 100% sure why bats evolved to hang upside down versus birds that sit up. One thing is bats are really the only creature that do spend so much time underneath things. So it's very different than all the animals like a squirrel, a mouse, a bird that's on top of a branch. All these guys are underneath here. It also does allow them to be able to take off really quickly. So all they do is, unlock those tendons and they swoop down a little bit and then take off into flight. But again, what I said before is most bats can't take off from the ground. And that's because of those tiny, tiny feet and those tiny claws. They don't have a lot of muscle there to push off to help them with their flight. So pros and cons to all different types of things in evolution. So that part of those tendons, that's called a passive digital lock that they have there. It's kind of cool, just kind of a really, really neat adaptation that they have for hanging upside down. And all bats have this. This is something that they all have in common. All right. Bats' most famous thing that they do is echolocation. This is really the sense that I'm going to focus on most today, but I just have to put it out there really quick. Bats are not blind. Bats can see. So when someone tells you blind as a bat, you say, oh, that's pretty good, because a bat sees about the same as a person with 20/20 eyesight, which is not me. I have to wear my contacts. So if they can see with 20/20, they're doing pretty good. The problem is bats in general are nocturnal. All bats in Connecticut are nocturnal, and their eyesight is like ours. It's not particularly great at night. So, so they depend on other senses. They do have a great sense of hearing, a great sense of smell, but this echolocation is what's really, really allowing them to be active at night. Think about an owl. They have those super large eyes. All right, that's what's allowing them to be active at night. So they have this echolocation. It is very similar to a sonar system. Basically, they're emitting a series of supersonic sounds. Those sounds are coming out. Most people cannot hear them on most bats. I've been doing this a long time. I've learned not to say absolutes all the time, but there's a few bats out there that's occasionally, especially kids, can actually hear the sounds of. The older I get, the fewer sounds I hear, but they have definitely have these really unique patterns of sounds that they send out, especially when they're hunting. And so those sounds then are going to bounce off what's close to them. These sounds don't travel really, really far though. So, if you watch, if you know a lot about submarines and you think about signals that are going out from a submarine underwater, they don't quite operate the same way because they're not able to put that distance. So a bat's echolocation calls will usually travel 2 to 10 meters in front of them. Occasionally, it might, in the right conditions, be able to go up to about 20 meters in front of them. And this contributes to bats' erratic flight patterns. So if you ever watch a bat flying around, you're cutting back and forth and going in all different directions. And that's because when you're only getting signals for about 20 meters in front of you, or less than 50 feet, you might have to make quick adjustments. Think about how far we can see when we're driving our cars. We plan way ahead, but if you could only see, a certain distance, you'd be constantly turning back and forth. So that is one of the reasons why they have that flight pattern right there. And I just wanted to play a quick little sound for you. Hopefully this will work so you can kind of hear what a bat sounds like when it's taken and put it into a hearing, our hearing range. So, let's see. So let me go back. Hold on one second. It's going to keep on going if I don't stop it here. It's 2 hours of bat sound effects. There we go. All right. So how we actually are able to hear those is by using bat detectors. And I have to say, if you ever have an opportunity to hang out with somebody who's got a bat detector, it's really cool. And the one I used to have was just a small handheld device. I got it from Bat Conservation International, and you'd go out and you could listen for bat sounds, and it just puts them into your hearing range, and you can really hear these bats constantly sending out these signals. It's pretty amazing. These days, of course, they make them that you can put onto your smartphones. And so you download the app, and then this little red thing that's on top of the tablet and the phone in the picture here actually is what's picking up the signals. They do cost about $300. But it is pretty cool if you're really into bats, or you have an organization that is interested in knowing what kind of bats you have. You can get those going, and these apps actually will help you identify the bat just by the sound. And so there's a lot of new studies going on about learning what bats are in our area just by hearing them, because bats can be hard to study because during the day they're hiding, they're sleeping, and at night they can be difficult to track and to find. So if you can go out and you can be listening for all these different bat calls, it's a really good way to study what bats you have in the area. I was doing some programming out on Fisher's Island in New York, and they actually had an organization going out there that was helping to document the biodiversity of the island. And so they were going actually out with large bat detectors to try to pull up all these different bat calls so they could really find out exactly what bats they had on the island. So it's a pretty cool thing. All right, so when that signal goes out, how does the bat know what's going on? So if you look at that top picture on the left, the bat's sending out the signal, and it's bouncing off the moth there. And as it comes back, you can see that the returns are getting a little bit larger as it's coming to the bat. So he knows it's kind of flying away from him. The bottom is the opposite. And then if you look at the picture on the right, you can see where it's bouncing against something stationary, bouncing against the tree. So they're staying about the same. So the bat is able to figure out, oh, that's an insect, or nope, that's a tree. I just need to go around it. Now, the thing about it is these signals are being put out there so that it can catch insects. Well, of course, the insects don't want to be eaten. And so a lot of insects are developing strategies through time so that they can avoid being eaten. And so if you look at this moth right here, this moth actually knows when a bat is coming near, and it can send out a signal where it jams the incoming echolocation calls. And so it does that. It rubs its genitals against its abdomen, and it makes this funny sound. It jams the radar, and the bat misses it. Other moths and insects are actually learning to just hear the call. They hear the call and they dive really quick. They go low and the bat misses it. So this constant kind of battle for these two species to kind of, try to keep a balance. Nature's all about balance, and that's something that they have been doing. It's pretty neat to kind of see how this works. A lot of times bats tend to win, but there's a lot more insects out there. So it all works out in the end. So reproduction. One of the things that kind of makes me sad is when people are like, oh, bats, they're like flying mice. And it's actually like, they're really not like flying mice at all. They're very different. And one of the ways that they're different is in their reproduction and their lifespan. So while mice live very short lives, they reproduce in large quantities, they have large litters, and at a very, very young age, they're able to reproduce. Bats are really different. A lot of our bat species live well over 10 years. Some can live up to 20 years, depending on the actual species. And they tend to only have one young at a time. Occasionally, they'll have twins, but they don't have these large litters, and they only have one per year. So it's not like mice who are just constantly reproducing. They are mammals, remember, so the young do nurse off their mothers. When they're very small, they can actually cling on to their mothers while she's flying around. But when they get bigger, they get a little too heavy for her. And so she'll actually just leave them hanging up in a tree, in a cave, depending on their species. So she leaves them there hanging, and then she comes back and she finds her baby by her sense of smell. A lot of bats, even bats that we consider to be solitary, have like maternal colonies. And so a lot of mom bats and their babies will be in one spot. So what's also really interesting about bats is that they mate in the fall. So they tend to mate in September, October, before they go into hibernation or before they migrate away. And then they actually do a delayed implementation. So the sperm is not going right up and being fertilizing the eggs and everything yet. And that's because they don't want that baby to be developing while mom is hibernating and using up her fat stores there. But at the same time, so you're like, well, why don't they just wait till spring? Well, bats are so hungry when they get out of hibernation that they need to focus on getting food. They don't need to be focused on finding a mate and all that kind of stuff. So they mate in the fall, and then the implementation happens in the springtime when mom is actually out and able to get enough food to sustain herself and the developing baby. So it's pretty neat. The babies tend to be very helpless when they're born, usually, like I said, only 1 to 2. So if you look at the bottom right here, there's a baby hoary bat. So you see mom, she's got the little yellow head right there, and then the baby is underneath her wing, just nursing on right there. To get an idea of size of baby bats, you can see that one bat clinging to the person's finger right there. Sometimes if a mom bat has twins, sometimes both of them don't make it. She may not have enough resources to be able to feed both of them. That happened actually, it was really interesting. I was a little nervous. I found 2 dead bats at my house this summer. Actually, my kids found them, my girls found them, and they came running up, Mom, there's dead bats. And so I went out to look, and they were very, very tiny. And I did some research and talked to Deep a little bit. And they said that just based on where they were, I have a group of bats that live on the side of my house, and that it was probably some young that just didn't quite have, weren't quite getting enough energy. And I still had plenty of bats flying around. So it wasn't something that was really affecting the entire colony. So just something to keep in mind as well. So where are bats right now? They're all mostly sleeping. There's a couple that migrate away, but most of our bats are hibernating, and a lot of them are not here in Connecticut. Our cave bats have to usually leave Connecticut to find the right place to hibernate. We have one big exception. So if you've heard of old Newgate Prison, it was an old copper mine, one of the first federal prisons, I guess, in the country as well. And it's the place in Connecticut where bats go to hibernate. But not all bats can go to the same place. And so some of our bats actually travel up to Massachusetts to hibernate, and some of our other bats travel to the Adirondacks to hibernate as well. And they're very, very picky on the type of cave that they're going to hibernate in. It's got to keep the right humidity level and the right temperature. Most of our bats will hibernate from October to April. And when they go into hibernation, they've actually packed on a lot of fat. So at least over 1/3 of their body weight is in fat to help them get through that. So if you look at that bat in the middle, you can see as they're hibernating, they can even get ice crystals that are forming on them. One of our exceptions, and it's still a hibernating bat, but big brown bats tend not to go into hibernation until very late, often not until December, especially, we had a very warm fall, at least down here on the coast. And I was seeing brown bats up and through, I'm trying to think, we did a program in December that I was still seeing a couple brown bats around, and they do tend to wake up the earliest as well. So sometimes you'll see them, in early March and things like that. So those big brown bats do tend to be a little bit of an exception to the true, October to April hibernation of many of our other bats. We will talk about a few bats that just migrate for the winter, but very few are bats. They can't be active here all winter because they're such strict insectivores, and they need to catch insects that are flying around. So some of our birds who eat insects, you might think of like golden crowned piglets or something like that. Okay, they're insect eaters, they're tiny, they survive the winter, but they can eat freeze-dried insects that are stuck to the side of the bark. A bat can't do that. Some of our other bats, some of our more solitary bats, they won't go into caves necessarily, but they will find just the right spot in a tree trunk and things like that to hibernate for the winter time. So before we really talk about the species of bats here in Connecticut, I need to talk about white nose syndrome, because otherwise I just constantly am mentioning it and you may not know a lot about it. So this is kind of a depressing fact here in Connecticut and around, actually pretty much now across the United States. And white nose syndrome is a fungal disease that is killing our bats by the millions. So I mentioned that Connecticut has 9 species of bats in Connecticut, and 8 of them are listed on our endangered species list at this point. And one of those bats, if I had been doing this program in 2000, I would have said, oh yeah, the most common bat, the little brown bat, they're all over the place. We have lost over 90% of our little brown bats. Literally millions of bats have died in the last 2 decades. It's really only the last decade and a half, since about 2006. And it is because of this disease. So this particular type of fungus came over from Europe. And obviously there's bats in Europe, there are cave bats in Europe. Those bats are adapted to this fungus. Our bats were not. So most likely what happened was somebody was doing some cave exploration. That's pretty cool. They were doing it in England or in somewhere in Europe. They got a little bit of this fungus on them and then came here, something got left on, a little bit left on their gear. They got into a cave in New York and it spread. And so, and then as soon as it got into the cave, it was able to spread to the bats. Because there's so few caves that bats like to hibernate in, it quickly spreads from bat to bat. So if you look at them, it looks like they have that white fuzz growing across their face. That is that's why it's called white nose syndrome. It actually is this fungus that gets all over them. So what ends up happening is it wakes the bats up. Because they're really, really dehydrated. And so they wake up, they go out, they're going to search for food, and there's nothing out there. They come back in. But because they've done that, they've actually used up a lot of their fat stores. And if you lose up a lot of your fat stores during hibernation, you won't have enough to make it through until the springtime. And so these are the kind of scenes that people are seeing is, dozens and dozens or hundreds or even thousands of bats outside of these caves that were not surviving. So this has been spreading pretty much across the country. Like I said, it started in New York. So unfortunately, Connecticut was really just a hop, skip, and a jump, because now it's not just being spread by someone who's exploring a cave, it's being spread by these bats. Since they actually migrate to their hibernation spot, they come back, they see other bats. It spreads from cave to cave. And while it's mostly affecting our cave bats, other bats like our red bat can pick up the fungus. It's not really affected by it, but if it gets into contact with another bat, like the little brown bat, it can spread it to them. So I just kind of wanted to show this map really quick. I'm just going to pull this up right here. And kind of shows, let's see if I can get it to come up for us. Here we go. All right. I'm going to bring this all the way back to 2006. And you can kind of see in 2006, it's right there in New York. And so just kind of let's see what happens. You can see how quickly it starts to spread. And I like to stop it here for just a minute. So this is 2016. You can see how it spread all over the eastern part of the United States. But then there's nothing really going on in the western part until this one spot in Washington. And that's telling me that's not a bat that spread it there. That's a person who spread it. So somebody had something on their cave or on their caving gear, and then went over to Washington, was exploring something there, and actually spread it unintentionally that way. And so it's really important for people who are spelunkers and really into cave exploration that they are super careful with their gear at this point, because of course, once it's in one cave on the West Coast, you can kind of see that it'll start to keep on spreading there now as well. So pretty much it is across the country at this point. And because it's so far across the country, it's affecting lots and lots of different types of bats. So here in Connecticut, the big brown bat, the small foot bat, the Indiana bat, the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, our tricolored bat are the ones that we have here that are affected by it. There's a few other species that we don't have in Connecticut, but you find in other parts of the country, such as the gray bat or the southeastern bat, Yuma bats, those types that are also being affected, but those are not native to Connecticut. So a lot of people are working really hard to try to get this under control. Connecticut Deep is very, very involved. They've partnered with the Department of Conservation in New York just to try to see what can be done. So lots and lots of organizations are working hard on it. You know, I did hear a little bit that they feel like it's stabilized a little bit. We don't seem to seeing a huge increase in loss of bats, but at this point we've lost so many bats already that it's such a dramatic loss that it's kind of tough to say, well, once you've lost 98%, you know, and so instead of going like this, now we're flattening the curve a little bit, but it's still not great. There are some studies, people have been trying to do artificial shelters for bats, like concrete caves that can be cleaned, different types of fungicides, but you know, there's a risk with everything that you do. So those things are all kind of being carefully studied to see what can happen next. All right. So on that note, let's actually talk about the bats that we have here in Connecticut. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these bat species. We'll start with what used to be our most common bat, which is the little brown bat. So not a particularly large bat. Its wingspan is about 8 inches, 10 inches. It is listed as endangered on our in Connecticut, and if it hasn't been listed federally, it's probably going to be listed federally endangered as well fairly soon. That's a little bit more of a challenge than just listing it as a state endangered species. Really 100% due to white nose syndrome. But these bats are found from pretty much all the way across the country. And this is a bat that sometimes gets into people's houses during the summertime. But it really likes like hollow trees and things like that during the summer. In the winter, it does need to hibernate in caves, sometimes in mines as well. This is where, you know, creating these cement structures have been actually fairly helpful, and these bats have actually moved into some of those. It likes to sip water off the tops of ponds and things like that. So if you have a quiet pond near your house, this might be a bat species that you see. It loves to eat midges and aquatic insects, stoneflies, mayflies. It loves mayflies, so it's going after a lot of those. And because it's a small bat, it can fall prey to things like raccoons or snakes, owls, things like that. It flies at speeds of up to 20 miles an hour, so it's a pretty quick bat, and it's actually beating its wings fairly quickly, usually about 15 strokes per second. Think about that. In a second, it's gone up and down 15 times. That's pretty fast. And this is a bat, like I said, who can eat hundreds of insects an hour for us. All right, this is the one bat in Connecticut that's not listed anywhere. So this is the big brown bat. So it's slightly larger than the little brown bat. So a couple inches larger. It has a little bit of a slower wing beat as well. And this is one that some people can hear the chatter without using one of those bat detectors. They can actually just hear that. It goes basically from the southern half of Canada throughout the United States down all the way into Central America. There's been some studies that this bat actually uses the Earth's magnetic field to help it find its way back to its roosting sites where it hangs out during the day, which is pretty cool. This is a bat that I find tends to be in suburban and urban areas a lot. It's a bat that I tend to get calls about at the nature center. People find it in their attic, they find it in their shed, they find it in their wood pile all the time. And also it's in hollow trees, places like that. And one of the things about bats, I said we have 9 species of bats, they're all eating insects. Well, why aren't they all competing with each other? Well, they all like just a slightly different habitat, and they eat maybe just in a different level of the forest or in the pond, by the pond and things like that. And so this guy tends to forage above the tree canopy. So remember, this little brown bat likes to be foraging around the bottoms of the ponds. This guy's going to be up higher, above the tree canopy right there, and often can go, because it's a slightly bigger bat, go for larger insects as well. So the northern long-eared bat, unfortunately, this is a bat that is believed to be extirpated in Connecticut. It has really suffered from white nose syndrome right here. And just, really struggling right now. It is considered federally endangered. It's a pretty good size bat, 9 to 10 inches. So between the size of the little brown and the big brown bat. But remember I said the big brown bat is going over the forest canopy. Well, this guy is between the shrub layer and the canopy of the forest. So it's actually going in between the trees. So if you're in a spot like in New York State where they still have northern long-eared bats, that's where you might find this bat. They are called long-eared bats because they have long ears. That's, in the grand scheme of these bats, their ears are pretty large. Tends to be most common for us to see them in the Adirondacks. So tends to be an East Coast bat as well. So you're not going to find this all the way across the country. All right, so this bat, they changed its name. Scientists like to do that. So I always called it the Eastern pipistrelle bat. A few years ago, they changed it to the tricolored bat. And so it is called the tricolored bat. It's a good reason. It has 3 different colors of fur on it. So it does make sense. This is a smaller bat. And it is endangered here in Connecticut. It's also federally endangered. So only about 3 inches, about that 8 to 10 inch wingspan as well. This guy likes really small flying insects, things like leaf hoppers. And so if you've ever been out in a field, doing some netting for insects, you catch lots of leaf hoppers like that. It tends to really like those. Once it gets in a swarm of insects, it can take 30 insects in a minute. So, if you've ever walked through like a swarm of gnats or something like that, this bat lives for that type of situation, and it's going to get 30 of them really, really quick. So if you're hiking and you get that swarm, you'd really want one of these bats to come by and it could just take care of that for you. one of the things to notice is, the wings are that blackish color, but you can really see the pinkish color of its forelimbs. You can almost see like the bones like through the skin right there. You see that pink color, and that really helps you to identify it. But it has a yellow color, a red color, and a yellow color on it. So those are the furs that gives it the tricolored bat name. You also see it in caves. So it'll hibernate sometimes with other species of bats. You don't just get a cave that's all little brown bats, or in a cave that's all tricolored bats. They will mix up a little bit. I think this picture is great because you can really see how tiny those teeth are right there. It's really good oral hygiene, nice and white there. Silver-haired bats. So this is a bat here in Connecticut that is considered special concern. It is a solitary bat. It tends to be a forest bat. There's something about his face that reminds me of like a pig face. They're really kind of nifty. Their fur is like a gray silver color. It's a good size bat. They're pretty easy to identify, if you see one, because of that color right there. And this is where your organization comes in really handy, because this is something that you guys do. By protecting land, you're protecting habitat for these bats. They need, undisturbed areas of forest, and that is what you guys can provide. And so unlike our other bats where we're worried about them becoming endangered because of white nose syndrome, this is basically due to habitat loss. Like I said, they're usually referred to as a solitary species, but the females do have maternal colonies. They do like to forage alongside of streams. That tends to be where they find their food, but then they're going back to that forest to spend their days there. And they also like conifers and mixed stands of forests. And so the further you get north in Connecticut, we tend to get more of those conifer type habitats. It's kind of an interesting thing if you study the forestry of Connecticut. Right where Mystic is and along the coast, we have much more of a central hardwood type theme, whereas you get north, you get a little bit more of those evergreens. And so where I live, it's a little bit closer to you guys. I live up in Salem, and you can start to see that just in my woods close to my house. They really do have a really cool name. The scientific name here means hairy wandering night bat. Kind of a cool name for them. So they do have really long fur too. All right, so remember I said there was one exception to like the strict insect eating diets of all of our bats. This guy is it. On a rare occasion, it might eat something like a small frog, but it is a very rare occasion here in Connecticut for it to eat anything besides insects. Hoary bats are a migratory bat. So they're one of the largest bats in North America, and definitely the largest bat here in Connecticut. And they have this yellow kind of like scruff or ruff around their face that makes them pretty easy to identify. And they actually are found from here to Central America. This is one of the few mammals, not counting marine mammals, that is in Hawaii. They have a hoary bat that's in Hawaii as well. So it's the same bat that we have here. And what happens is, well, there's a few cases where they have found hoary bats hibernating for the winter. The majority actually will just go south. So as it gets cooler, they keep on heading south, so they'll go down to, Virginia, and then down to Florida, and then make their way back up for the summertime here. So they're considered one of the longest distance migrants of any of our bat species. They have a very erratic flight pattern. So unfortunately, one problem that they have is that erratic flight pattern for them and another bat that we're going to talk about soon, the red bat. They often end up stuck in fencing, sometimes like barbed wire fencing or in chain link fencing. This is a bat that can get caught there. So this is another bat that's considered special concern in Connecticut. Again, it's a solitary bat, so it's not suffering from white nose. It tends to be habitat loss. This is a bat that can eat very large insects. So it's going to eat moths, it can eat grasshoppers, beetles, dragonflies even. And when it gets something that large, it can't eat it on the wing. So it'll actually have to go back and hang upside down and eat its food that way. If we look right here, we have the red bat. And so red bats, they are a little bit smaller, like body-wise, but they have a pretty good wingspan. And this is a bat that unfortunately sometimes gets hit by cars. And it's because they prefer this open habitat. And they do tend to forage pretty close to sunset. So sometimes we see this bat a little bit more at sunset time. It tends to come out pretty early. And what's neat is it roosts during the day in the foliage of deciduous trees. And so when it's folded up, it kind of just looks like, a little dead leaf hanging in the tree. And you would never take a second look going, oh, that's actually a bat that's hanging there. So these guys are the ones that are really solitary except during mating and migration. They don't even put together a maternity colony or anything like that. So the Indiana bat is a very small bat. So if you think about its body size is only 1.5 to 2 inches. So that's really, really tiny, wingspan about 10 inches. This is a federally endangered bat as well, really struggling from white nose syndrome. Called the Indiana bat because the first place that it was recorded was in Indiana. They don't have a particularly large population of them in Indiana compared to anywhere else, but they are found across the eastern United States. And sometimes they roost, the females will actually roost together, so you can get a nice big group of them. And what happens is the females, as they start heading into caves, the males all wait right outside the cave entrance so they can mate with the females as they're all going in. So the males will go into hibernation after the females have all gone into hibernation, and they've made sure that they've had all their chances before they go in. So kind of a neat bat right there. All right, this is a really cool bat. This is the eastern small-footed bat. So I said that I've been at the Nature Center for a long time, but I took a few years off and I moved to California from like 2013 to 2017. I talked about bats before I left, did some things in California, came back to the Nature Center, and when I went to do my bat program, I'm looking at my list of bats in Connecticut just to refresh my memory. And I was like, wait, we didn't used to have this bat here in Connecticut. This bat had gotten added to the list while I was gone. And it was pretty interesting. They thought this bat was extirpated from the state. And what ended up happening was somebody found one in their house. They knew it was hurt. It was brought to a bat rehabilitator who went, I don't know what kind of bat this is. And they, working with the state, were like, oh, this is the eastern small-footed bats. So cool. And then started doing some more studies, started using the bat detectors like I showed earlier, and found out that we do have a population of these bats here in Connecticut. So it kind of a cool thing, that this bat could literally go undetected in the state. The last recorded sighting of one had been in the 1940s. So, for like 70 years, people didn't think this bat was here anymore. And so it gets its name. It has really tiny, tiny back feet, even for a bat. So that's where it gets that name. But it also has a black face mask. It kind of looks like those, masks that you put on for a masquerade ball right over there. And it's very, very dark right around their eyes. All right. We do not have this bat here in Connecticut, but I always feel obligated to mention it. So I've gone through all the bats that we have here in Connecticut, but I always feel obligated to mention vampire bats because people are really curious about them. We do not have them in Connecticut. Usually it's Mexico, Central America, and South America where they tend to have them. Usually warmer climates, tropical climates, or arid climates that have these vampire bats. In some ways similar to our bats, they roost in caves and colonies, but a few just interesting things about them. These bats don't suck blood. Vampire bats were actually named after vampires, like people vampires had already had stories about them before these bats were discovered, and then they gave the name to the bat. And what they do is they do bite on, usually onto, it's really interesting these days, they usually bite onto livestock, so cows or birds. And with the birds, they usually bite onto their feet. And they put a little cut and then they lap up the blood. So they're not actually sucking the blood out. And usually it's about a tablespoon of blood. If they have a really good feeding and they get 2 tablespoons of blood, one thing about them is they're actually then too heavy to be able to fly again. So remember I said most bats can't take off from the ground. Vampire bats are one of those exceptions. It has to do with how they feed, that they end up on the ground. So they need to be able to take off from there. There's been a lot of really amazing studies about vampire bats. I highly recommend learning a little bit more about them, like their social structure. They will share food between each other and things like that. It's pretty incredible. So if you've ever been really freaked out about vampire bats, just do a little research on them. They're really, really cool. One thing that they is being studied right now is their saliva. Their saliva has a lot of anticoagulants in them, and they're using them to see if they can actually help treat stroke victims with some of the things found in their saliva. So anyway, I always like to mention them just because people always have questions. We do not have vampire bats in Connecticut, though. The other thing that people are always curious about are the biggest and the smallest bats in the world. So I always like to mention those as well. The largest bat in the world is the golden-crowned flying fox. And if you don't get to go out to the Philippines ever to see one of these, occasionally they will have them in some of our different zoos. I got to see one in the Oakland Zoo one time. Their wingspan is 5.5 feet. Think about bald eagle. Bald eagles have a 6 to 7 wingspan, so almost that size, larger than a red-tailed hawk. These are big, big bats, and they're a fruit-eating bat. So really, really neat bats there. And then the smallest bat in the world is the Kitti's hognose bat, also known as the bumblebee bat. And its wingspan is less than 5 inches, but its body size is only 1 inch, and it weighs about the same as an actual bumblebee. And they're found again in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, and Myanmar is where you would actually end up finding these guys. So it's kind of a neat little facts about bats. So here in Connecticut, though, back to Connecticut, we have some predators of our bats. The most common ones are, again, nocturnal animals. So owls tend to be a bigger predator of bats than a hawk would, because a hawk is awake during the day. Great horned owls, screech owls, barred owls, they all will be very happy to have a bat for dinner. Raccoons are another predator of bats, and that's because they get up into the trees and they think nothing of reaching into holes looking for food. Snakes, like the rat snakes who get into trees as well, can be a predator of bats, and our house cats. And I love cats, but they can definitely be a problem for bats outside. They catch them, they can damage their wings and things. All right, another interesting thing, the problem that bats are facing are wind turbines. And I lived in California for a long time. I really believe in clean energy and our clean energy future, but there are ways that we can be really efficient about it. And we just need to be aware of, the pros and cons to everything. And when we talk a lot about how wind turbines affect birds, we don't talk a lot about how they affect our bat populations. And what they're finding is, it's not that the bat is actually hitting the blade of the wind turbine. It's that these turbines are so huge that they actually, affect the air that's in, and they cause these vacuums of air and low pressure, and it actually hurts the lungs of the bats. And so that is what is causing a problem, because the air pressure is different from their lungs to the surrounding air. It's so different that their blood vessels are actually rupturing. And so this is just something that we want to be aware of, so that just like we want to protect birds during migration and things like that with our wind turbines, we want to be aware of that for bats as well. So if we know that our bats are heading up to a particular cave, this might be a time to adjust our wind turbines and things like that. So just something to keep in mind. Tree bats seem to be especially affected as well. And again, one of our endangered species, the northern long-eared bat. There's not been a lot of studies done yet about how climate change itself is affecting our bat populations, but we do know when we have changes in temperature, it affects animals and their hibernation. We also know when we have changes in those temperatures, it's affecting the phenology of our insects, and then our insect phenology changes, that affects everything that eats them. So we talk a lot about how that affects our birds. It's also affecting our bats. Extreme weather events, just like it affects us, it affects all wildlife. And so animals are often something that fall victim to, major blizzards or hurricanes and ice storms, things like that, which are all things that we're seeing an increase in. The one thing that they have studied, and this is mostly in Central America, is range changes for our bats. Positive, negative, it's kind of one of those things that they're noticing that certain bat species that used to be only found in lower level elevations, as the climate's warmed, these higher elevations are warmer and those bats are moving their ranges up. And that can affect the species that are already there. So it's just something we, again, want to be really aware of. So what can you do to help bats? Try to limit your pesticide and insecticide use. The big reason why is insecticides, sometimes it doesn't kill the insect. So the insect is weakened, makes it easier for the bat to catch. The bat then is getting that insect with the insecticide into its system. Those things tend to be stored in the fats of the bat, gets released during hibernation, and can cause problems. Creating bat-friendly spaces. So I am a big proponent of native planting. So if you want to help bats, pick native plants. I never tell anybody, don't go and clear out your entire landscape. But the next time you're buying a plant or something like that, think about, is it a native plant to Connecticut? We have a lot of amazing native options that we can use here. Native plants attract our native insects, which then help our animals further up the food chain. Build bat houses. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Not being afraid of our bats is a huge thing as well. And if you're really into spelunking and cave exploring, that's awesome. But make sure you're really cleaning your gear before you go from one thing to the next. And supporting your local land trusts and heritage centers is a really important thing as well. Protecting the land protects the habitat for these animals. So bat houses, I always like to give just a few recommendations about them. Bat houses are a great thing to do. There's lots of places that you can put them. It provides, usually females end up going into them. It provides a safe place for their young. If there's not a lot of tree hollows near you, it can provide a really good spot for that. It can also make sure that it helps so the bats don't necessarily get into your house. They might move literally into your bat house that you put up for them. But a few things. If you put a bat house up, 15 feet is usually about the recommended height. You don't want to go too much lower. You can go a tiny bit higher, but not necessarily too much higher either. So about 15 feet. You also need 20 feet of clearance to that bat house. So if your woods are right here and your house is right here, make sure there's at least 20 feet, because that bat needs to be able to swoop in and then it comes up, because remember, it's got to catch with its little feet. And then when it comes out, it needs that big clearing to be able to get up and fly again. So 20 feet of clearance. Usually want 6 to 8 hours of sunlight on it a day. So usually south facing, southeast facing. You do not need to paint your bat house. If you do, paint it a darker color. Make sure you're using non-toxic paints and things like that. And if the bat doesn't move in within like 2 to 3 years, you got to give it a couple of years, especially right now because our bat populations are low. Move your bat house to a new spot and try again. Usually, if they haven't found it in about 3 years, it's probably worth moving it to a new spot. And I will tell you, I've had people who, have had them up for 2 years and then they come, they're all excited because the bat finally found it. Especially, if you put it up in midsummer, they're already going to have found their spot for that year. So, they may not find it till the following year. So if you're thinking about putting a bat house up for this year, you'd want to do it, by mid-March or so. So as bats coming out of hibernation and coming back into your area are finding them. So again, you want to make sure the bat houses can help to deter bats from coming into your house. Bats are small, they can fit into lots of different places. So things like your chimneys, eaves are really, this tends to be the big point of entry for people, is roof vents right there, windowsills, things like that. And sometimes even, your cellar doors can be a spot where they get in. So you just want to just kind of pay attention to that. So bats, this is a little red bat. I just like to leave with this picture. It's so cute. This is a little red bat pretending it's a leaf. Bats are they're fascinating creatures, and they're such an important part of our local ecosystem. So I hope people can take a few minutes to appreciate them this summer as you see them flying around, catching your insects and things like that. So thank you so much. I'm happy to try to answer a few questions for people. I'm just gonna stop my share there and we can get going.
Great. I'm going to start at the top and move down. So first question is, can you attract bats?
So you can, it's a little tricky to attract bats sometimes, but the biggest thing is a bat house definitely helps. Native plantings, and in order to have bats here in Connecticut, you got to have some bugs around. And so having not killing all your insects helps to get the bats in to your house, or not into your house, into your yard is where you want them. So that tends to be the best thing. I recommend native plants and a bat house. Sometimes a water source can be good too. So if you have a bird bath or things like that, that can be a good thing for them.
Great. Continuing with the bat box, you talked quite a bit about it, but an idea for a template to buy to build a bat box?
So I highly recommend Bat Conservation International, BCI for short. They're out of Texas. They're an incredible bat organization. They have great templates online if you want to build it yourself. A lot of places though, I'm blanking on the name where you buy all the good bird seed. But anyway, Wild Birds Unlimited often has bat houses as well. Sometimes Audubon shops also will have them, and they're a great thing if you don't want to build one.
Right. Any tips on sighting a bat?
So where I usually look is over ponds, and I usually go out at dusk, and I usually go out at dusk because that gets my eyes used to being out in the dark. Don't have a flashlight, keep my flashlight off, so then I can look for them going back and forth across the pond. The other place that I tend to see them though is if you live in a more suburban environment. That doesn't mean you won't see bats. I lived in New London for 10 years and used to see bats. And I would tend to see them underneath the streetlights. And that's because the streetlights were attracting the moths. The bats would come in to eat them as well. So, but for rural areas, I usually recommend close to water.
Is there any research into genetic commonalities among bats that seem to be more resistant to the white-nose disease?
So I know they've been doing a lot of research trying to compare the bats in Europe and why they are resistant to white nose syndrome. Obviously, they evolved with it. And then they're also looking closely at the bats that are surviving white nose. So why did this 10% survive? And seeing if that hopefully, those genetics will carry on. I haven't been really following that particular part of the research, but I know they are studying that.
Now, back to bat houses. This person has a bat house that is aluminum sided, and she read that that's not a good that is not a good place for one. I have a wooden access door, but it is surrounded by aluminum. So, is there a recommendation where is a better place to put it?
So the problem with aluminum is it's really slippery, so like a bat can't get onto it at all. So if you had any part of your house that's wood, sometimes being on a door may not be the best place, but if it's on a door and it's got like a surrounding of wood and you don't mind having it, you don't use that door very often, that would be an okay place. If you open and close that door, it's not going to be okay. But like a shed, and honestly, I'm going to get myself in trouble, but if you don't really have the best spot to put your bat house on your house, people always don't put it on, you can put it on a tree. The problem with trees is that it makes it easier for raccoons and snakes. The other thing that a lot of people do, there's a person's house I drive by on a regular basis, they have it on poles, and you can totally put them on poles in your yard. And it's really kind of neat because they will come in because that gives them that clearing. So if you've got a good yard, you put it on that pole and they come up onto it. Kind of looks a little funny sometimes because instead of having a pretty birdhouse on your pole, you've got these fun bat houses there. But it does work. A lot of organizations will actually recommend that. So if you're up for it, putting it on a pole is a good option.
Right. Many photos show bats hanging out together. Are they sharing body heat, or is there another reason for that pattern?
It tends to be sharing body heat, and for the winter time, they definitely are sharing body heat when they're hibernating. Also, though, it can be protection from predators, that safety in numbers thing. If I'm hanging out with 30 of my closest friends, maybe I won't be the one that gets eaten. So that kind of thing.
You're already addressed about mounting on a tree. Should you clean the bat house to prevent the WND?
So you need to clean it during the winter, and you need to make sure you have no bats that hibernate in it. So just like shine a flashlight there, make sure there's no bats, and then cleaning it is a good thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then just to clarify, is the pole better or the side of the building better?
So most organizations will tell you put it on a pole, but I don't want anybody not to put a bat house up because they can't or don't want to put a large pole in their yard with a bat house on it. And so most people do put them on the sides of houses, and that is absolutely fine. Technically, if you really want to do the absolute 100% best thing, a pole is probably better. I will tell you, mine's on the side of my house.
Great. I think that's all the questions for now. So Courtney, I'll turn this back to you.
Great. Well, Kim, thank you so much. That was fascinating and so educational. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.